Prime Minister on ministerial arrangements.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Minister for Foreign Affairs will be absent from question time this week, and the Attorney-General will answer questions on her behalf. The Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources will also be absent this week, and the Deputy Prime Minister will answer questions on his behalf.
I thank the Prime Minister. Questions without notice. The member for Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Given there are reports today that up to 6 government MPs support the member for Farrer's private members bill to phase out live sheep exports, does the Prime Minister support the bill, and will the Prime Minister support further debate on the bill and ensure that government members on the selection committee are aware of his views so that all members can have their say on this very, very important issue?
The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, matters to do with the selection committee and the schedule of the House are not in the responsibility of the Prime Minister. It was not a general
Members on my left.
It was not a general question. It was a very specific question about when the bill would be dealt with and how the process would be unfolding. I'm happy to answer that question, but it's not within the responsibility of the Prime Minister.
The Manager of Opposition Business, I allow him to speak on the point of order.
To the point of order, Mr Speaker. It's impossible, I think, to view the part of the question that says, does the Prime Minister support the bill, as being answered by anyone other than the Prime Minister. And will the Prime Minister pass on the
Manager of
views?
Opposition Business might have just sort of made the point there. That's the only part of the question I think that's in order. No, probably best you don't. Certainly that part of the question that asked whether he supports the bill, I'm going to allow. The Prime Minister has to call.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. The government supports a live export trade that respects animal welfare and obviously respects community views on animal welfare, and we are taking immediate action to ensure that animal welfare is maintained, the jobs of thousands
Members
of Australian
on my left,
farmers
the member for
are preserved, and our export markets are respected and maintained. Now, as honourable members know, the Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources commissioned a report from Dr Michael McCarthy, and what that has done is recommend a number of changes to the export regime. In summary, on live sheep voyages to the Middle East for the coming northern summer, sheep will get 39% more space and stocking densities will be reduced by up to 28%. The reportable mortality level will be halved from 2 to 1%. Independent observers, on behalf of the government, will be on the vessels to make sure that these standards are maintained, and the observers will be reporting daily to the regulator. Now, Mr Speaker, the government—
Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, given that you ruled the only part of the question that was in order was whether or not the Prime Minister supports the private members bill, he should be relevant to that.
Yes, I have been listening very closely. I say to the Manager of Opposition Business, when he's talking about the substance of the topic, which is the subject of the bill, I really can't see how he's anything other than in order. The Prime Minister's in order.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker. So, Mr Speaker, the government's objective is, as I said, to ensure that animal welfare is maintained, that animals are treated humanely in this transport, that the livings and viability of Australian farmers, particularly in Western Australia where most of these shipments are derived, are respected and maintained, and that our export markets are maintained. We do not want to have a repetition of the debacle that we had under the Labor Party, where the entire live cattle export business was banned, and as a consequence, farming families across the nation were facing ruin. The price of cattle crashed, whether it was in the far north of the country all the way down to Tasmania. That's the sort of recklessness the government will not be a party to. Now, what we have put in place, and the Minister, who is absent, as I said, has put in place, is a careful and considered approach based on science, and that is why the government does not support the bill.
The member for Petrie.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please outline to the House how the government is strengthening the economy and backing business to create even more jobs for Australian workers, including in my electorate of Petrie? Is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. Mr Speaker, only last week we were at Kennedy's Timber, a business in his electorate where we saw the results of confidence, of determination to invest and build a business. And indeed, Mr Speaker, in a week when we learned that Australians had together created, since the coalition government was elected under the leadership of the member for Warringah in 2013, 1,013,600 jobs. Months before the 5-year target, ahead of time, and those jobs, Mr Speaker, have been built by the optimism and the commitment and the passion of Australian businesses like Kennedy's Timber, and, as Michael Kennedy observed during our visit, he took on one new employee in April, and she may very well have been the 1 millionth new employee taken on in Australia. And, Mr Speaker, this is the consequence of Australians rising to the challenge of investing, of having a go, of taking a risk and building their businesses. Now, Mr Speaker, we have enabled that and supported that with one policy after another that creates more opportunities for Australians to invest, whether it is lower business taxes, whether it is an instant asset write-off, whether it is ensuring that there are more export opportunities by creating one big free trade deal after another with China, Korea, Japan, Singapore, more recently Peru, and of course the 11-nation Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we recall the Labor Party urged us to abandon and said we were deluded in pursuing it. So, Mr Speaker, by cutting taxes for small and medium family businesses, we have seen this great growth in employment, and we must not forget that a business that revenue is $50 million a year or less is not a giant business. It's overwhelmingly going to be an Australian family-owned businesses, but more than half of all Australians work for those Australian small and medium family-owned businesses, and they are the ones, like Kennedy's Timber, that are responding to the incentives we've created. Now, Mr Speaker, this enables us to guarantee and deliver increasing funding for the essential services Australians rely on: schools, hospitals, security, keeping Australians safe, the vital economic infrastructure we need. All of this is enabled by a stronger economy. And yes, there is an alternative. It's the alternative of Labor, with over $200 billion of new taxes, which would crush that energy and that growth.
Has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister support Labor's bigger, better, fairer income tax cuts
Members on my right.
that will give a teacher earning $65,000 a year a tax cut of $928 a year, almost double the amount they've been promised by the government?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, if even John Setka doesn't trust the Leader of the Opposition, and he pays for the campaign of the Labor Party. He's the principal funder, the controlling shareholder, the primary financier of the Labor Party. If John Setka doesn't trust the Leader of the Opposition, why would any Australian voter, any Australian worker trust the Leader of the Opposition? How could you trust the Leader of the Opposition with his rolled gold guarantees? It's not so long ago there are a few more faces sitting opposite Mr Speaker. They were apparently rolled gold guaranteed to be eligible to sit here. Well, they've all had to resign. And, Mr Speaker, the fact is that the Leader of the Opposition cannot be trusted on one promise at all. This is a leader a man who seeks to be Prime Minister, who stood at this dispatch box and said lower company taxes delivers more investment, greater productivity, more jobs and higher wages. Great stuff. Great. Did he believe it then? Who knows? Does he believe what he's saying now? Who knows? John Setka doesn't know. Nobody knows.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
On a point of direct relevance, why won't the Prime Minister answer the question why he won't support Labor's almost double income tax cuts compared to his own?
The Leader of the Opposition. Prime Minister's concluded his answer. The member for Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How does a stronger economy create more jobs for Australians, including in those in my electorate of Ford, and is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Ford for his question. Like everyone on this side of the House, we are as pleased as that 1 million jobs have been created in this country since the election of the coalition government. 1 million jobs. That's what was promised, and that's what's been delivered 5 months ahead of schedule. 1 million jobs, 1 million Australians going out there, seeking work and finding it in businesses that are growing and expanding and creating jobs for Australians all around the country, including in the member for Ford's electorate. 415,000 jobs created last year, 75% of them, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, full-time jobs. Some 32,700 full-time jobs in the most recent employment statistics. Now, all of this comes about because Australian businesses are going out there and they're investing and they're growing, and they've got the right set of conditions and they've got the right environment and the right policy settings to do exactly that. And our plan for a stronger economy, the plan for a stronger economy that we set out again in this year's budget, is about backing businesses to create local jobs. That's what it's about. Those opposite, the Labor Party wants to attack business. They want to put their taxes up. They think somehow that's going to incentivise them to create jobs. Now, we know that putting reduced pressure on businesses enables them to go out there and create those jobs, just like True Blue Glass, who I was with the member for Ford at Loganholme in his electorate last week, Mr Speaker. A family business, less than $5 million in turnover, 25 employees. Now, under this government, they're described as a small business. Their turnover is between $2 and $10 million. They get the instant asset write-off, which has been extended for a further year. They get to do GST on a cash basis. They get pooled depreciation. We believe they're a small business. The Labor Party thinks they're a multinational, Mr Speaker. No different with the Coxon's Radiators up there in the member for Capricornia's electorate. Coxon's Radiators, a great Australian business run by Julie and Gary. Now, they have a turnover of almost $50 billion a year. They employ 35 people. They're not a multinational. They're a great Australian regional small business success story. And you know who their biggest clients are? They're BHP, they're Glencore. And you know who's going to benefit from all businesses in this country paying more competitive rates of taxes? Coxon's Radiators and Rockhampton, Mr Speaker. That's who's going to benefit, because we have a plan for a stronger economy over the next decade. We knew, Mr Speaker, that as a government with the right set of policies, 1 million jobs could be created in this place. The member for McMahon didn't. He didn't believe it could happen. He said we will fall well short of our solemn pledge. Well, the solemn pledge of 1 million jobs, Mr Speaker, has been delivered by the Turnbull government.
The member for Canberra.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Why won't this arrogant and out-of-touch Prime Minister support Labor's personal income tax plan that will give a married couple, one serving in our defence forces, earning $90,000.
Members on my right.
Because people don't care about the ADF, Mr Speaker. And the other working in aged care on $50,000, a total tax cut of $1,856 a year, almost double the amount they'll get from the government.
The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, the government gives the opposition a lot of leeway in terms of its questions, but I would
members on my left.
I would urge you to caution the member for using insults and epithets at the beginning of that question. She's perfectly entitled to ask a question about aged care.
The Leader of the House will pause for a second. Members on my left will cease interjecting. The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, the member is perfectly entitled to ask her question, but she should not start it with insults and epithets. That's quite out of sight of the standing orders.
Members on my left. I would have thought members on my left would be the last people wanting to delay question time, but they're succeeding. I thank the Leader of the House for his point of order. I'll certainly say this. There are some phrases in questions and indeed answers that are less than desirable, but the approach I've taken, and the Leader of the House knows this, is that whilst I don't think it really adds to our business here in the chamber, but if that sort of question is asked, the person asking it should expect at least equal treatment in the reply. The Prime Minister has the call. The member for McEwen, I don't understand what he said, but he's warned anyway. It's too loud. The Prime Minister has the call. The Prime Minister has the call.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for a question. Mr Speaker, the government's plan for personal income tax is a long-term plan that makes the personal income tax system fairer and provides more incentives for Australians to get ahead, to get a raise, to get another job, to take a promotion, to work some overtime, to start a business. Mr Speaker, the honourable member mentioned a worker on $50,000 a year. That worker would receive $530 back next year from the, as a tax refund under the government's plan. But, Mr Speaker, more importantly, and over the longer term, the worker the honourable member talks about is going to know that she will be working in an environment where 94% of Australians will not pay a marginal tax rate on an extra dollar more than 32.5 cents. That is the reform, and that is going to mean that from $41,000 all the way up to $200,000, a marginal rate of 32.5 cents will apply. It will provide enormous incentives for people to get ahead. It's not as low as the tax rate that the Leader of the Opposition recommended years ago. He thought there should be a top tax rate of 30%, but it is 32.5%, and of course it isn't unlimited as he proposed years ago. It is it stops at $200,000, where the 45-cent marginal rate commences. Now, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party have made a number of false statements about our personal income tax reform. One of them, which has been comprehensively debunked, of course, but it bears repeating, is that this is unfair. Mr Speaker, a person on $200,000 under our reforms will pay nearly 13 times as much tax as somebody on $41,000. They'll earn about a little less than 5 times as much, but pay nearly 13 times as much tax. In fact, taxpayers in the 45-cent tax category will pay a higher percentage of total personal income tax receipts than they do today. So this is a plan that is thought out, it's considered, it is long-term, and it provides the assurance that we will be respecting and encouraging the incentive and the enterprise, the spirit that has delivered us 1,013,600 jobs since the coalition came into office, and that is the spirit the Labor Party would crush with their job-destroying anti-business program.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. Just before I call the member for Denison, I just want to briefly take the time of the House to add to my earlier comments of the in response to the Leader of the House with respect to his objection to that question. I should point out 2 things. There's certainly precedence for those sort of questions, as much as I think some of the language is unnecessary. But the other point I'd make is there is some language in some of the answers from ministers with respect to the Leader of the Opposition that I find unnecessary as well. And if I think it's becoming a big distraction in the chamber. I certainly will take action on both sides, but I don't want to, at this point, censure debate. The member for Denison.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, the damage bill from the severe weather event and subsequent flooding in Greater Hobart on 10 and 11 May has now reached many tens of millions of dollars. Can you advise the House of the emergency arrangements the federal government has enacted? Can you also confirm that people affected by the awful event, including the local councils, will have the full cooperation and assistance of the federal government in accessing government support, including funding? And do you commit to instructing officials to respond with a real sense of urgency?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question, and I want to commend the people of Hobart and the surrounding areas for their resilience in dealing with the region's worst storm in many decades. So often, natural disasters throw nature's worst at communities, but at the same time, when nature throws its worst at Australians, it brings out the very best in the Australian character. Now, I can confirm that the Commonwealth and Tasmanian governments have activated assistance under the jointly funded National Disaster Relief and Recovery Arrangements. The Commonwealth and Tasmanian governments acted swiftly, announcing the assistance on the 14th of May, as the honourable member I'm sure is aware. The assistance includes grants for people on low incomes to help with temporary living expenses, replacing essential household items, and grants for repair, restoration and clean-up. It provides assistance for local councils to help them with the cost of removing debris from residential properties to make them safe and habitable, and restoring essential public assets such as roads and bridges. The assistance is available in the 6 local government areas of Clarence, Derwent Valley, Glenorchy, Hobart, Huon Valley and Kingborough, and the federal government is working closely with the Tasmanian government to assess the impact of the floods and to identify any further recovery assistance that may be needed. Now, my government, as the honourable members know, works with all state governments to make sure they have the support they need in the wake of these natural disasters, and it's the responsibility of the state and territory governments for their part to work directly with local councils. Mr Speaker, I think I can speak for the honourable member and indeed all members when I say to the emergency personnel and the volunteers who give up their time, who courageously put their own lives at risk and their personal safety at risk, and coordinate the logistics to keep people safe and rescue them, protect their property in the times of these disasters, we say once again, thank you. We must never forget that they bring out the very best of the Australian character in the way they volunteer and take on these storms and fires and floods, and they do so because of their love and commitment for their fellow Australians. So, Mr Speaker, time and again, in the face of these storms and natural disasters and fires, Australians show grace under pressure, bravery in the face of danger, and rally without a second thought to help each other.
The member for Page.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on recent announcements of nation-building and job-creating regional infrastructure, including in New South Wales, and is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd be happy to update the member for Page on our nation-building infrastructure program. I'd also be happy to update him on any alternatives. And the answer to both is jobs. The answer to both is jobs. 1 million jobs. How exciting is that? 1 million jobs created under this government's policies, Mr Speaker, by small and medium family enterprises, Mr Speaker. Not necessarily government, but by business. And the alternative I'm asked about is also about losing jobs, making sure that the road and rail projects that we're putting into place, Mr Speaker, will be in jeopardy if those opposite get into power, Mr Speaker. Now, the member for Page was there last week at the Coffs Harbour bypass announcement, Mr Speaker, along with the member for Cowper, $971 million to that project, which is going to save lives, ease congestion and make sure that people get to their destinations sooner and safer. $971 million, which is going to create hundreds upon hundreds of jobs in the construction phase, Mr Speaker. But we're delivering nation-building infrastructure through our $75 billion decade-long infrastructure pipeline, Mr Speaker. That is all about jobs, creating jobs in the construction phase, connecting regional communities. That's even more jobs, Mr Speaker, and making sure that people get home sooner and safer, and that's what it's all about. But I'm asked about the actual pipeline, Mr Speaker, and we look at the $3.5 billion for roads of strategic importance, not necessarily national highways, Mr Speaker, but indeed those secondary link roads in regional Australia, connecting regional communities, connecting farm gates to ports, to markets, Mr Speaker. $1 billion for the M1 Pacific motorway upgrades, $600 million for the Northern Australian Roads program, $744.5 million for the Black Spot program. Again, a program saving lives. And I was in Darwin, standing on the corner of Lee Point Road and Union Terrace, Mr Speaker. That's a Black Spot program that is funding program that is going to save lives. It will. It's already cost one life, Mr Speaker, and far too many casualties, been identified by government and will be fixed. $4.8 billion for the Roads to Recovery program, enabling local councils to decide which roads they feel are in need of an upgrade. Mr Speaker, now, while I was in Darwin, I chaired the Transport and Infrastructure Council meeting, and we all agreed to work together, and there were ministers of all political persuasions delighted at the budget announcements, delighted at the $75 billion worth of infrastructure rollout that we're doing, and prepared to work collaboratively and cooperatively with the Commonwealth to ensure that we roll out that pipeline, to ensure that we connect regional communities, to ensure that we ease congestion in our capital cities. That's what we're getting on with the job of doing, creating jobs, creating better infrastructure, building a better Australia. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The member for Kingston.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Why won't this arrogant and out-of-touch Prime Minister support Labor's personal income plan that would give a childcare worker earning $50,000 a tax cut of $928 a year, almost double the amount they'll get from the government?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for a question. And, Mr Speaker, the honourable member is part of a team, a Labor team, that is going proud. She said she's proud of it, proud of going after self-funded retirees' savings, proud of raiding the life's earnings of grandmothers and grandfathers. She's proud, Mr Speaker. She is so proud. She's proud of cutting the income of the lady in her 80s I was with in Queanbeyan recently by 28%. 28%. That's what the Leader of the Opposition and his team, his proud team, want to do. They want to rip $5 billion a year out of the savings of older Australians. For they want to do that. They want to do that so they can fund their reckless spending plans. And they want to pose now as cutting taxes. Well, Mr Speaker, Australians know the Labor Party and they know their leader very well. They do. They know he can't be trusted. Mr Speaker, think about this. I talked about how he's switched sides on company tax. What about Fair Work, the Fair Work legislation? In 2008, the Leader of the
Manager of Opposition
said,
Business on a point of order. The Prime Minister.
Speaker, on direct relevance, on your previous rulings about the policy topic having to be kept to, I think we're already way off.
The Prime Minister. The Leader of the House is not helping. The question was about, with as I said again, an undesirable lead-in, but it was about taxation. The Prime Minister's been talking about taxation. I'm going to hear from the Leader of the House on the point of order.
Well, Mr Speaker, I don't want to make this an ongoing saga, but further to the rulings you've made previously in question time, The question began with epithets about the Prime Minister's character, which means they open up by asking such a question a very wide gamut which the Prime Minister is entitled to respond to. It's not just a question about personal income taxes. It was also a question about the Prime Minister's character, and he's responding to that part of the question. If they don't want him to do so, they shouldn't put those epithets in the question.
I think that is a reasonable point. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So in 2008, the Leader of the Opposition, when a minister in the Labor government said the Fair Work Act would create workplaces where our children will do better, not worse, than we used to, and in which prosperity expands and embraces us all. It was really touching, actually. Very touching. But, Mr Speaker, he doesn't say that anymore. Oh no! Oh no! Now when he turns up to the controlling shareholders meeting, that's to say, meeting with the CFMEU, he describes these self-same Fair Work laws as a cancer, which need to be rewritten. So, laws where our children will do better, not worse, in which prosperity expands and embraces us all. A sort of nirvana. Happiness, Mr Speaker, for everybody. That's in 2008. And now, because he's answering to the call of his paymasters, he says those very same laws, written by the government of which he was a minister, are a cancer and must be abandoned. No wonder nobody believes the Leader of the Opposition.
The member for Gilmore has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how the government is acting to make sure retirees and pensioners are given more choice to live longer and healthier lives, especially those in my electorate of Gilmore? Is the Treasurer aware of any other policy alternatives?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Gilmore for her question. This year's budget once again provides a clear plan for a stronger economy, because we understand that you need a stronger economy to guarantee the essential services that all Australians rely on, and that includes older Australians, Australians going into their senior years, Mr Speaker. And our plan for a stronger economy means that we've got a clear plan to give Australians more choices for a longer life. That's what this budget delivers. More choices for a longer life. That means we're protecting the choices of Australians as they age, and we're protecting their dignity as well. Last week I was pleased to join the member for Gilmore in Nowra, as I was the member for Petrie up in North Lakes, where we were talking to Australians, senior Australians, about our new package, our new plan for more choices for a longer life. And we were going through what those measures were. $10,000 for a restart wage subsidy to ensure that Australians as they age, if they want to get back into the workforce, there is the same sort of subsidy to support them doing it as there is a younger Australian. Extending the pension loan scheme, not just to where it was before with part pensioners, but to all pensioners, all self-funded retirees, all older Australians of pension age will be in a position to access that program, which for a couple can mean $17,000 extra income each year. Increasing the pension work bonus, which means that older Australians can earn $1,300 extra a year. It doesn't touch their pension. And even better, if you're self-employed, as an older Australian, you can earn $7,800 and it doesn't touch any of your entitlements in relation to the pension. 20,000 aged care places for in-home care, 14,000 announced in the budget, 6,000 announced last December, to ensure that Australians who want to choose to stay in their home and remain in their home and live with their families and enjoy all of the things that they have in their later years, that can be delivered as well, Mr Speaker. $82.5 million for mental health support for Australians living in residential aged care. $146 million, Mr Speaker, for residential aged care in rural and regional areas, Mr Speaker, to ensure that those needs are being met. So we're a government that's delivering for older Australians, to give them more choices, to protect their dignity. the Leader of the Opposition wants to put his grubby hand into their pocket and rip out their tax refunds, Mr Speaker, because the one single issue that came up time and again, whether it was in Nowra or North Lakes or elsewhere in the country, they have a clear message for the Leader of the Opposition. Get your hands out of our pockets, Mr Speaker. The single biggest tax measure over the budget and forward estimates, the big bucket of cash he wants to use to spray around the country, to buy votes around the country, is being paid for by self-funded retirees, by pensioners, by small business owners. He's got his hand so deep in their trousers, Mr Speaker, they are wincing at the prospect of a Labor government.
The Treasurer's time has expired. The member for Brand is warned. The member for Brand is warned. A reminder to look at the practice on interjecting when not sitting in your... Well, I'll have a look at the update and check. Just simply don't take offence, but I won't take the word of the member for Moreton. I won't. The member for Cowan has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister. Why is the Prime Minister giving an $80 billion handout to big business instead of supporting Labor's personal income tax plan, which will leave middle-income Australians better off? Why is this arrogant and out-of-touch Prime Minister looking after big business instead of middle-income Australians?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I thank the honourable member for a question. And the honourable member represents the seat of Cowan in Western Australia, and she understands very well, I would hope, the importance of business investment, of entrepreneurship and enterprise, and she should understand that the growth in jobs across our nation, and particularly in Western Australia, following the inevitable downturn of the mining construction boom, has been based on hard-working Australian businesses investing and having a go. Overwhelmingly, Australian-owned family businesses. And these are the businesses that her leader wants to tax even more. We have reduced taxes on businesses with turnovers up to $50 million a year. She is a member of a party and that wants to increase taxes on those businesses. So she's got to go out across Cowan and go to all those family businesses and say the Labor Party wants you to pay more tax. And Mr Speaker, do any of us imagine that when the honourable member does that, do you think those businesses are going to say, oh, that's terrific, oh, in that case we'll hire some more people? No, they won't. What the Labor Party is doing is putting at risk the jobs that have been created since September 2013, the 1,013,600 jobs, the fastest, largest jobs growth in our nation's history in 2017. All of that is being put at risk by an anti-business tax grab from the Labor Party. Over $200 billion. Taxes on grannies and grandpas. Yes, it is. They're going after them. Retirees, self-funded retirees. And, Mr Speaker, the honourable member would have quite a few of those in her electorate. She should perhaps go to a seniors' meeting. Oh,
the member for Rankin
is calling back. Apparently in Cowan, older Australians are looking forward to giving 28% of their income to a Labor government.
The member for Cowan.
They're lining up. Well, Mr Speaker, I would never challenge the honourable member on this matter, but I have to say I find her version of events quite implausible, having been to Cowan on a few occasions. Mr Speaker, I have no doubt that Australians, older Australians, whether they are in Cowan, whether they are in Maribyrnong or in any electorate in this House, they expect respect and support, and they will not accept a government that goes after their savings.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Corangamite has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Jobs and Innovation. Will the minister outline to the House the results of the government's unrelenting focus on supporting the creation of more jobs in our economy, including in my electorate of Corangamite? Is the minister aware of any other approaches?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Corangamite for her question. Mr Speaker, this government has created over 1 million new jobs in the last 4.5 years, 5 months ahead of the promise that we took to the 2013 election. It is a remarkable achievement. In places like Corangamite, where the member represents, I was visiting there last Friday, a firm called Fibertech, which is in the defence industry space. It's benefiting from the decisions this government is making in the largest mobilisation of our defence and defence industry in our peacetime history, Mr Speaker. Driving jobs, innovation, technology, Mr Speaker, that is helping the economy to create those over 1 million jobs 5 months ahead of schedule. But, Mr Speaker, this achievement is very much placed at risk by the Leader of the Opposition's secret agreement with the CFMEU, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition has a secret agreement with the CFMEU which he has refused to reveal to the Australian public, Mr Speaker. And it really is a responsibility of his to release that secret agreement so that Australians can see what the Leader of the Opposition has promised John Setka and the CFMEU in exchange for their support, Mr Speaker. Now, we know that John Setka only on the weekend said that unions should operate outside the law, Mr Speaker. He said that on Sky News. He also said, remarkably, as an aside, that he didn't trust the Leader of the Opposition either, Mr Speaker. Now, you'd think a person with a secret agreement with the Leader of the Opposition, who's given $2.5 million of donations to the Labor Party since the Leader of the Opposition has been in that role, would have some ounce of trust for the Leader of the Opposition. But even he, along with the rest of the Australian public, doesn't trust this Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker. Peter Beattie said on the weekend that the Labor Party should not take donations from the CFMEU. Bob Hawke said that if he was the leader of the Labor Party, he would have expelled the CFMEU from the ALP like he did with the BLF, Mr Speaker. This Leader of the Opposition is placing that jobs growth at risk because he insists on bringing the CFMEU into all the major decision-making of the Labor Party. Mr Speaker, he owes it to the Australian public to release the secret agreement he has with the CFMEU, a man who has had 59 convictions in civil and criminal offences over the last few years. It's time the Leader of the Opposition came clean with the Australian people and told them exactly what he's promised John Setka and the CFMEU in exchange for the power that they've given him within the Labor Party.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Given it is now almost 2 weeks since the Treasurer delivered his budget, can the Treasurer now provide figures for the year-by-year cost of each stage of his 7-year personal income tax scheme? If not, how can the Treasurer expect the Parliament to vote for his scheme?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I further member to my earlier answers on this point.
The member for Wakefield.
I note, Mr Speaker, that it's always one rule for the Labor Party and it's one rule for everyone else. Because I'm looking here at Labor's plan to crack down, it says, on tax loopholes and protect pensioners and pay for schools and hospitals, Mr Speaker. I'm looking also at their fairer tax system, they call it fairer tax system on dividend imputation reform. All these policies, Mr Speaker, they have provided a 10-year estimate. They haven't provided a 4-year estimate, but no year-by-year estimates after the 4 years. So they expect the government to do something that they don't do themselves, Mr Speaker. But more than that, they have released policies on negative gearing and CGT back in 2016, PBO. Did they release the PBO costings? No. Family tax benefit beam, Mr Speaker, did they release the costings from the PBO? No. Making superannuation fairer, they said, package? No, they haven't released that. Tobacco taxes? No, they didn't release that. The 0.5% Medicare levy increase in the top 2 tax brackets, they never released that. The trust tax of 2017, they didn't release that. The retirees tax of 2018, they didn't release that, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party think that they can run the country like they run unions. One rule for the union bosses and one rule for everyone else, Mr Speaker. The union bosses get the credit cards, the union workers get the bills, Mr Speaker. That's what we get from the Labor Party. And so they come in here knowing full well how budgets work. Well, I assume the Shadow Treasurer knows how they work, and he will understand exactly what the policies are. Now, Mr Speaker, what our tax plan does is provides real reward for effort. It's a plan, a real plan, that deals with real problems in the tax system. It deals with bracket creep, which the opposition seems not too willing to engage with us in dealing with bracket creep. Under our plan, someone who was on full-time average wages will be paying less tax under us over the next 10 years, Mr Speaker. Under their plan, they will get swallowed up by bracket creep. That's what will happen with Labor's plan. Labor should support the government in addressing bracket creep, in ensuring that as Australians put extra effort in and extra hours in, they shouldn't have to pay higher rates of tax. Under our plan, our full plan, 94% of Australians will face no higher than 32.5 cents. No higher than 32.5 cents as their marginal rate of tax. That's a plan, Mr Speaker. What we've got in our budget is a plan for a stronger economy. It's a plan to reward Australians who are working harder and expect to keep the money they've earned, and the Labor Party just wants to rip it away from them.
The member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on the steps the government has taken to protect Australian families from dangerous visa holders? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question, for the hard work he does in his electorate of Flynn. And, Mr Speaker, as all Australians know, we've been able to stop boats and stop the drownings at sea, get children out of detention centres, close 17 detention centres, and in securing our borders, Mr Speaker, we've now turned our attention to making sure that we can cancel visas of criminals on shore who have committed serious offences against Australian citizens. We don't want people coming to our country who are going to victimise Australians. We don't want people coming to our country, Mr Speaker, who are going to involve themselves in criminal activity. One of the areas of concentration for us, Mr Speaker, has been the cancellation of outlaw motorcycle gang members who are here as non-citizens on visas. So far, and I can update the House today, we've cancelled 181 of those visas. Mr Speaker, it's important for a number of reasons. One of the principal activities of members of outlaw motorcycle gangs is in the importation and the distribution of the horrendous drug ice, a scourge right across the country, but in particular in regional areas. But one of the other main areas of endeavour for the outlaw motorcycle gang members, Mr Speaker, is to work in conjunction with members of the CFMEU. They work with the CFMEU, Mr Speaker, because many elements of the CFMEU are also criminal in nature, and they are involved in extortion on building sites around the country. And, Mr Speaker, if you follow the web, who else is associated with the CFMEU? The Leader of the Opposition. The Leader of the Opposition. Now, the Leader of the Opposition is cosy with the CFMEU because they support his position at the conference. He can't get up. He can't get his position on policy up, particularly in relation to boats, Mr Speaker. He didn't at the last conference without the block of the CFMEU. If only it stopped there, Mr Speaker. The reality is that the Labor Party accepts millions and millions of dollars from the CFMEU, and I noticed, Mr Speaker, reading the fine journal of the Courier Mail this morning, that had this wonderful story, Mr Speaker.
The minister knows the rules on props.
That's a fair point, Mr Speaker, but let me read it to you. It says, "Stop this unholy union. $2.4 million in fines. Judges at wit's end, but the ALP still pockets their cash." And, Mr Speaker, nobody in this country, nobody in this place, nobody who has had any dealings with this Leader of the Opposition can trust a word that he says. The fact is that the CFMEU are tolerated in a way that they would never have been under any former Labor leader. He accepts their cash, He accepts their direction, and the Australian people should never trust this man.
The minister needs to withdraw that last part of his answer where he said the Leader of the Opposition accepted their cash.
Mr Speaker, I withdraw.
The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. What is the total cost of corporate tax cuts over 10 years from 1 July this year, both legislated and proposed to be legislated by this government?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I further remember my previous answers to this question for the simple reason we have no policy to increase the rate of corporate tax in Australia. We have no such policy. So the government hasn't gone and costed a policy to increase taxes on small businesses, on medium businesses or large businesses. We're not doing that. That is the Labor Party's policy. The Labor Party's policy, as recent and as minted as the Leader of the Opposition's presentation at the dispatch box after the budget, is to increase taxes on all businesses above $2 million in turnover in this country. And, Mr Speaker, when you run through, if the Labor Party were ever to occupy these benches, what would be the single biggest revenue earner over the budget and forward estimates if the Shadow Treasurer became the Treasurer? Would it be putting up taxes on big banks and businesses? No, it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be at all. Would it be, indeed, on lifting the marginal tax rate on the highest income earners in Australia? It wouldn't be that either. Wouldn't come close. Would it be on family businesses, on family trusts? No, it wouldn't be that. Would it be negative gearing and capital gains tax increases? All of this does add up to a lot of tax, I admit. There's a lot of taxes coming from that side. The single biggest revenue measure, the single biggest tax slug that the Leader of the Opposition, the Labor Party, is going to put on Australians in their first budget, if they are elected, over the budget and forward estimates, is on retirees. Over $10 billion, and that's just 2 years. They're just cranking it up. Retirees are being forced under the Labor Party's policy to get their shovels out and put their hard-earned into the Leader of the Opposition's pockets so he can run around and make big political promises. But Australians understand this Leader of the Opposition. They know how shifty he is, Mr Speaker. They know he's shifty as when it comes to using other people's money to try and put forward and promote his own political agenda. He is unbelievable, Mr Speaker. He is completely unbelievable.
The Treasurer, no, the manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. The Treasurer will withdraw. I know he's used that phrase outside the parliament.
I misspoke, Mr Speaker. I withdraw.
I really don't expect the member for Griffith, who interjects frequently, to be giving me advice on discipline in the House. The member for Sydney has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, the call alternates. The member for Bennelong had been on his... No, he wasn't actually. Let me be fair about this. I was a bit slow, OK? The member for Bennelong has the call. Member for Bennelong.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services. Will the minister update the House on how the government's tax policies encourage and reward hard-working Australians, including those in my electorate of Bennelong? And is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The minister has the call. The Minister for Revenue and Financial Services.
I thank the member for Bennelong for his question, and I note that, like everyone on this side of the chamber, he is absolutely focused on ensuring the prosperity of all Australians through our enterprise tax plan, making sure that we back businesses to invest in those businesses, and to also make sure that government lives within its means so that we have prudent fiscal management. And it is because of our plan, our economic plan, that we have seen more than 1 million jobs delivered, a promise that we have made on this side of the chamber that has been delivered by a coalition government. It is a significant achievement of all of those businesses who work incredibly hard and who employ hard-working Australians. But we on this side of the chamber believe in rewarding hard work and aspiration. We believe in doing that through making sure that they don't pay $1 more of tax than they absolutely need to. And that is why, under our first stage of our personal income tax plan, around 10 million working Australians will see lower, fairer and simpler taxes. And by the end of our tax plan, we will see around about 94% of Australians face a marginal tax rate of no more than 32.5 cents in the dollar. And the only thing standing between those millions of Australians and their tax relief is those sitting opposite. It will take one vote here in the House of Representatives and one vote in the Senate. Now, of course, the member asks, are there any alternative approaches? Well, there is one, and that is from those sitting opposite, and it is higher taxes. Higher taxes on retirees, higher taxes on homeowners, on small and medium-sized enterprises, on family businesses and on all Australians through their retirement savings. In total, those opposite will put their hand in the pockets of millions of Australians and pick more than $200 billion worth from those people who have worked hard for that money. And they don't just have that terrible indignity that they want to impose on Australians. They also want Australians to believe that they are going to somehow deliver a surplus. Now, Mr Speaker, I ask those in the chamber, what do these 5 things have in common? The internet, the European Union, the Hubble Space Telescope, the Simpsons TV show and the Harry Potter book series. Not one of those things existed when those opposite last delivered a surplus 29 years ago. Now, the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, he treats the Australian people as mugs, but they are not mugs. They know all about his roll gold promises and they know he cannot be trusted.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. In responding to Labor's plan to provide 100,000 fee-free TAFE places, the Minister for Education criticised vocational education policies that covered, and I quote, everything from energy healing to basket weaving. Is this the government's view of TAFE and vocational education? And is this why this arrogant and out-of-touch Prime Minister is cutting another $270 million from TAFE and apprenticeships in this year's budget, on top of the existing $3 billion of cuts to skills?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy, representing the Minister for Education.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, when Labor was last in office, they saw the largest single decline in apprentice and trainee numbers ever on record, a 22% fall when Labor was last in office, Mr Speaker. Between 2011 and 2013, Labor was responsible for cuts of $1.2 billion, Mr Speaker. And then when Labor put forward its alternative plan, there was no detail around it, Mr Speaker. No detail, except we know there are $200 billion of extra taxes. Now, the Turnbull government will be establishing a new, ongoing $1.5 billion Skilling Australia's fund. We'll create up to 300,000 apprentices over the next 4 years. And we will ensure, through the $70 billion plus of infrastructure spending, that there are new jobs for these apprentices and for Australians around the country. So we've also introduced a number of other measures to support apprentices. The $900 million Australian Apprenticeship Support Network to support employers to recruit, train and retain apprentices. We've introduced trade support loans, which have seen over 53,000 apprentices access up to $20,000 each in government support for their apprenticeships. So, Mr Speaker, we don't just talk about doing something for apprenticeship, we actually deliver, while Labor's promises are always on the never-never.
The member for Bonner.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the minister outline to the House the impact of the government's trade policies on job creation? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bonner for his question. He's passionate about job opportunities for Australians, especially in export industries. In fact, I remember going with the member for Bonner to Grove Juice. Grove Juice, another great example of an Australian small to medium-sized enterprise that's scoring export success. Another Australian business that will be advantaged because of the Coalition's vision when it comes to company tax cuts. And what we know, Mr Speaker, is that 1 in 5 Australian jobs are trade-related. Now, you'll excuse me for taking a little bit of time to explain to the Labor Party what 1 in 5 actually means. We saw some difficulty from the Brains Trust over there on the night of the budget to reply with their 1 in 5. We'd all remember they put together a collective. They're big fans of collectives, the Labor Party. Would have put together a collective 1, 2, 3, 5. I mean, it's so close, but we do trust you. We trust you with managing the nation's finances. I'm sure it'll be absolutely fine for the nation's finances to be in your hands. But that notwithstanding, 1 in 5 jobs in trade-related industries. Now, under the Coalition, we've seen 1 million jobs that have been created under this government, which means 200,000 extra jobs created in trade-related industries. 200,000 more Australians, Mr Speaker, who can now be appreciative of the fact that thanks to the Coalition government's vision with respect to free trade agreements, we're actually making sure that we are creating jobs together with Australian businesses for mums, for dads, for sons and for daughters. That's the record of delivery of this Coalition government. But the problem is, Mr Speaker, the member for Bonner asks about alternatives. Well, unfortunately, there are some alternatives, because Labor's proposal with respect to Australia's trade agenda is to effectively tear them up. Labor said that they're going to renegotiate our trade deals. In fact, the Shadow Minister for Trade runs around and says, oh well, the Coalition did the TPP-11, but if Labor gets to government, they're going to renegotiate it all. So they're going to put at risk, they're going to put at jeopardy all of the job creation that this government's put in place by the surge in exports that we've been able to lock in thanks to this government's forward-leaning agenda on trade. New trade deals with Singapore, with the TPP-11, with Korea, with Japan, with China, with Peru. We're about to start a trade negotiation with the European Union, and we're hopefully very close to concluding a deal with Indonesia. That's this government's track record of delivering on trade, of delivering on jobs, on creating a more competitive economic framework through lower taxes, which ensures 200,000 more Australians with jobs as a consequence.
The member for Cunningham has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will this arrogant and out-of-touch Prime Minister support Labor's plan to cover upfront fees for 100,000 TAFE places to train Australians for jobs that have been languishing on the visa skills shortage list for years and years?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for a question. And, Mr Speaker, the government is not going to be taking lectures on vocational education from the Labor Party. The complete debacle—
Members on my left, the member for Lindsay—
that the Labor government left us with billions of dollars being advanced in loans for courses that had little or no value to people that had no prospect of ever being able to repay them. It was a complete catastrophe. We're cleaning up that mess, putting vocational education on the right track, and I refer the honourable member to the answer of the minister just a few moments ago.
The member for O'Connor has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Development, Territories and Local Government. Will the minister update the House on how regional Australians, including in my electorate of O'Connor, will benefit from the budget and a stronger economy? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Regional Development.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for O'Connor for his question. The 2018-19 budget will in fact deliver in spades for the good people who call the vast electorate of O'Connor home. Be it from Albany to Arthur River, Kalgoorlie to Katanning, the coalition government has a plan for a stronger economy right throughout O'Connor, right throughout regional Australia. Now, Mr Speaker, we are backing regional Australia, and in particular we're backing the Building Better Regions Fund. Following the success of round one of this fund, over 20,000 jobs were created throughout regional Australia. The second round, currently under consideration and assessment, we've now, through the budget, locked in another $200 million for the third round of the Building Better Regions Fund. This means more projects, more opportunities, more jobs throughout regional Australia. Now, all members throughout the House would also welcome another round of the Stronger Communities program, which has already seen over 5,000 local job-creating community projects and infrastructure projects created across the country. Great news for families, great news for local communities, great news for local economies. Now, Mr Speaker, we won't stop there. We're delivering for regional Australia right across the board. As the Treasurer and the Deputy Prime Minister have announced, a $75 billion infrastructure pipeline, a $24.5 billion funding in place for new major projects and initiatives, $3.5 billion for roads of strategic importance, and $250 million for major business case fund. I'm excited about the budget, Mr Speaker. I'm excited about regional Australia. Now, I'm asked if there are any alternative approaches. Well, it's pretty obvious on the other side of the House they don't even have a plan for the regions. They'd prefer to cuddle up to inner-city Greens. They'd prefer to threaten the jobs of those hard-working Australians in the mining industry. They'd prefer to support ridiculous vegetation management legislation brought down by Queensland Labor, threaten to take it across the country, therefore threatening the livelihoods of farmers right across our nation. Now, the opposition leader, he'd rather force Australians onto the dole queue than stand up to those Greens and those inner-city activists who now run his party. He has no plan for regional Australia, Mr Speaker. He has no idea at all.
The minister's time has concluded. Members on my left. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's $17 billion cut to schools is going to hit public schools the hardest. And Catholic Education said today that the government school funding model delivers funding cuts to hundreds of Catholic schools. And this will deliver a hit to the cost of living for many parents through increased fees. Why is this Prime Minister pursuing an arrogant and out-of-touch policy of cutting $17 billion from schools whilst giving $17 billion to the big banks alone?
Members on my right. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, repeating a falsehood doesn't make it true. And the Labor Party and its leader constantly claim that there are cuts in the budget to schools when in fact, our needs-based funding model for schools delivers an additional $24.5 billion over the next 10 years. Support for government schools rises from $7.7 billion to $9.7 billion from 2018-19 to 2021-22. Support for non-government schools rises from $11.8 billion to $13.8 billion from 2018-19 to 21-22. All of that is in the budget papers, so the proposition that schools funding is being cut is untrue. It is untrue. Schools funding is going up every year. And as far as Catholic schools are concerned, Mr Speaker, there are record levels of recurrent funding for Catholic schools, totalling $6.6 billion this year, rising to $9.2 billion in 2027, and funding will grow by around 4% per student per year on average over 4 years.
The member for Moore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs.
Member for Moore will pause for a second. Members on my left will cease interjecting. The member for Moore will begin again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on the importance of skilled migration in supporting businesses and regions to grow when no Australians are available? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Citizenship.
Well, can I thank the member for Moore for his question? It was great to visit his electorate a few weeks ago and hear from locals about their skills needs in northern Perth. Mr Speaker, around the country we're seeing the job creation policies of the Turnbull government in action. There are jobs being created in every city, in every town, in every state around the country. 1 million jobs have been created since we came to government, Mr Speaker. But what this means is that in some regions and some industries are actually finding it difficult to find workers. There's simply more jobs being created than workers that are available. Locals in Kalgoorlie, for example, the member for O'Connor's electorate, tell me that there are 500 positions which are vacant in the WA Goldfields area. The tech industry tell me similar things, and in some regions, such as the member for Leichhardt's electorate, which I visited, you've got very unique skills which are being required, such as Mandarin-speaking scuba diving instructors, because the Chinese tourism is so great up in that area. Mr Speaker, the government's policy is to prioritise Australians for Australian jobs, but when none are available to support businesses to sponsor people into the country. So consequently, we're putting labour agreements into place for key industries. We're working on regional agreements in the member for O'Connor's and Leichhardt's electorate, and we've announced a global talent scheme, Mr Speaker, in order to attract high-end talent to support innovation. These are all carefully calibrated policies to address the labour market tightening. And I'm asked about alternatives, Mr Speaker, and while we've got a carefully calibrated policy to adjust to labour market demands, the reverse occurred when Labor was in government, because when Labor was in government, they actually saw not an increase in jobs but a decrease in jobs in their last term in office. 17,000 jobs were destroyed in their last term in office. The welfare queues extended by 250,000 people under the Labor Party. And while that was going on, while jobs were in decline, while welfare queues were going up, what do you think was going on in terms of foreign workers coming into the country? You'd think you wouldn't need many, would you? But no, they had record numbers of foreign workers coming in on 457s, despite the job market going backwards and welfare queues increasing. And Mr Speaker, who was in charge? Who was in charge at that time when that was going on? Who was the Workplace Relations Minister at that particular time overseeing this? It was none other than the Leader of the Opposition, Bill Shorten, who wants to implement these policies should he get back into Parliament.
The Minister will just refer to members by their correct titles. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice
Just
paper.
before